Don't forget, the ancient Egyptians were a civilization that functioned coherently for thousands of years. And I think it was because they were able to provide answers to questions, profound questions of the human condition that we can't really find today. And I think that this is one of the greatest treasures that they can offer us, apart from how they conceptualize the very fabric of reality, which is all tied into their afterlife beliefs. The function of the mummy is to act as an anchor in the here, and there's a lot to explore. Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be joined by Carla Berenice, who's going to enlighten us about ancient Egypt. Her project is one of, I would say, making is an open source access to ancient Egyptian life and metaphysics, stealing it away from the ivory tower of academia. She's very present on Substack. I will link to her Substack, and she's also going to tell us a few things about her project on Substack and her project more broadly. Speaking, so I'm delighted to have you. We're going to talk about ancient Egypt, meaning of life in ancient Egypt, and maybe also cosmology and a few philosophical ideas. So welcome, Carla.
Hi, Johannes. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And I'm very excited about our conversation and excited to have found you on Substack and your publication. I found you through your course on Faust 2. Yes. And I love what you do there. It's similar to my approach, where you sort of teach very complicated, high concept content for everyone at a level where so a layman, everybody who's interested can sort of get access to these philosophies and writings, and I love that approach that you take as well.
So let's begin with it's a very broad question. You can take any direction. If I say to you the meaning of life for an ancient Egyptian, what would that even mean? How should we think of that?
What surprised me when I actually started searching for meaning in the ancient Egyptian culture, I came across in a book by Jan Assmann, the German Egyptologist, and he explained that meaning is actually not something that has to be found or conceptualized in ancient Egyptian culture, but it is something that is already built in within the metaphysical system. And he goes as far as to say it is the actual metaphysical fabric that holds the entire culture together. And they call it ma'at, which is basically intranslatable. It means both justice, it means higher order, it means balance, harmony. It sort of is in itself a concept that describes this condition of the metaphysical fabric being at its highest state in perfect order and harmony. So everything is as it's supposed to be. And the notion here is that meaning comes from this structure and purpose is upholding the structure. So that is all already built into the cultural concept of Ma'at, and the upholding of Ma'at is inscribed in their ideology. So the first and foremost task of Pharaoh, for instance, is to uphold this order and uphold Ma'at. And in exchange, he gets life from the sun god. And that is how the entire machinery and also the very seeds of their cosmology are conceptualized. So that's also in their iconography, something you would always see. You will see Pharaoh sometimes as Sphinx, which is symbolic for him as a mediator between two realms, holding the feather that symbolizes Ma'at, higher order, and then he receives Ankh, the Ankh sign, from the sun god. For instance, you see that in the so-called Ben stone on top of obelisks. That's the imagery that you will find there. So it's really the crown of their entire ideology.
So we began, with a broad view, if you had to try and describe almost regular everyday life or experience of just an ordinary Egyptian, how would they have perceived life or meaning, maybe in contrast with how we consider meaning in our nihilistic age?
I was most surprised when you would go into the literature. There are great texts. First one is the conversation of a man with his ba, with his soul. And there are some other texts where they really go deeply into the everyday experience of these higher religious concepts and into their fears and anxieties and the questions that they have. What is it all about? What is life all about? And here you can clearly see that for the everyday Egyptian, there are doubts, and they even question: is there actually a life after death? Who knows? But you can tell that they were all familiar with all of these concepts. So it was not something that was only communicated at political level or at sort of elitist level. It was something that would permeate the entire culture. The same as literature. Even if they were illiterate, you would still know all these important texts and hymns. And so it was definitely something that would permeate all layers of society, but it was not universally just accepted. There was discourse, lots of discourse about the actual purpose of life, the meaning of life, and the whole notion that everything should be, the entire cultural engine should be geared towards the afterlife. So that's one aspect, but the other aspect is that the overall purpose, as far as I can read in the sources, it was definitely the need for order and for ma'at to be upheld. And the minute they felt that through conquest or through other disasters, this order was disturbed, that was the greatest collective trauma to be endured, that they could not be parted from this concept that Egypt was. So they felt a deep connection to that fabric. To what extent everybody was familiar with the deeper philosophy of the metaphysics behind it, I couldn't tell you, but the feeling of being part of something greater and that being their purpose is something that you can definitely detect in the sources, I would say.
Great, thank you. So Plato, by the way, in his Laws and the Nomoi, he praises the rigidity of Egyptian culture. I don't know if you would agree with that. It is perfectly rigid, with unchangeable laws, etc. Nietzsche, a few thousand years later, would say that this is, it's a sort of a symbol of death. It's a mummification of truth. But this may just be because he really hated anything that Plato had to say. So, is there something to that? Is it the mummy obviously being one of the symbols that we have of Egypt? Is there something to that, or is it?
I think the Egyptian would answer that it was not rigidity; it was permanence that was most important, and permanence could have been perceived as rigidity because yes, they would not stray from their rituals, because the ritual was part of the ma'at and of upholding their meaning and their purpose. So to them, this came as natural as eating and sleeping. It was just something that had to be done to maintain life. Because don't forget, the maintenance of ma'at and of continuity was also what granted life and what granted the entire state of mind that Egypt was. So to them, I think it was something that came so natural that it was not perceived as rigid. It was just perceived as something that had to be upheld at any cost, because otherwise they felt it would all fall into chaos, because that was the great enemy to their worldview, was chaos and disorder that would bring about the end. That's their notion of apocalypse. You also have a lot of apocalyptic literature that talks about that, that the greatest loss is not death and starvation. The greatest loss is when that culture would be conquered, and there would be a foreign king. They would not understand their cultural patterns and the need for their rituals, and then everything would fall into disorder. And their cultural engine would not work anymore without an Egyptian pharaoh at the top, or a pharaoh that would uphold Ma'at and these principles. So that's, I think, what would seem rigid. Which is funny. Their greatest criticism towards the Greeks was their periageia, their curiosity. So they would write, what was getting on their nerves the most is that the Greeks would always just come and sort of get a surface level knowledge of their culture, like tourists, and then leave. And they said, you cannot understand us if you don't sort of join us. So then we have Pythagoras, who went to the temple, was allowed entry, and learned their ways, and studied at the temple, studied their teachings. And they wouldn't send him away. They would give him access, but he had to adapt their lifestyle. So famously, he lived on this crazy diet, and everybody says when he came back, he was a changed man. And then he started his own cult and his following and his teachings. But it was not that they were hermetically sealed as a culture and would not tell people, but they said you can't just gain a surface level knowledge of our culture and then claim to understand it. And that's something that annoyed them to no end about the Greeks. So that's what I can answer to point.
Okay, good. So the Greeks as tourists, that's a new one for me. Yeah, Nietzsche might maybe agree with you. I don't know if you're aware of this, the Corpus Hermeticum, where Hermes Trismegistus writes, Egypt is an image of heaven. Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt, all the operations of the powers which rule and are active in heaven, or cosmos, maybe, have been transferred to a lower place. Even more than that, if the whole truth be told, our land is the temple of the entire cosmos.
Yeah, that sort of puts what I described in the beginning, the notion of the purpose of humanity is to uphold order and ma'at through ritual, through basically turning entire culture into a large temple, conducting these rituals, and in exchange receiving life force and receiving this closeness to the gods. So that explains. I think that is exactly what he's writing there. I mean, Hermes Trismegistus is writing in Greek, and there's also a section in there where he or whoever the author is talks about the problem of intranslatability of a lot of ancient Egyptian concepts, and especially hieroglyphs and the language and the religion, saying that it's hard to explain these concepts through sound, because they are so closely linked through this to the symbolism and the myth and the sort of symbolic thinking behind it. So it's a very important text, but it's a text that is very conscious of its own limits. I have not read everything. I've only read parts of it, but I think it's a very sincere attempt to translate ancient Egyptian thought and metaphysics and cosmology into Greek thought, but it also reflects on its own failure. It's an inevitable failure, because it says that the Egyptian cultural technology, number one, is hieroglyphs. So you can only understand the culture entirely if you read it in the original script. And that is mentioned, I think, more than once in the text. And then also sort of plays into what I mentioned before, that the Egyptians said, you have to live here, you have to read our writing system, you have to read our texts in the original, you have to come and live with us and become one of us, learn our language, to really understand what this is all about. And I think that's why every reception of Egypt that goes through Greek texts is suffering from a lost in translation problem, and not because anybody's at fault for this. Anybody has misunderstood. There is just deeper meta levels of some symbolism and meaning that cannot really be translated.
There's many different directions I could go in now. I want to come back to hieroglyphs because you teach your, I'll just say, seminar participants, your Substack seminar in your Substack monastery. But you do live sessions and everything, and you teach them hieroglyphs. So we'll come back to this. But if you could just spell out perhaps even a bit more explicitly the purpose of the human being. I mean, you've already said it, but I think it's so unusual to hear this, that the human being, and not just the pharaoh, is really tasked with, has a cosmic purpose. It seems like it is, and that purpose is not, to consume, but for example, as we are doing, but to be attentive to nature, so that there is no chaos, Greek word. Quite similar, by the way, just to speak of the Greeks briefly. I read Plato's Politeia, the so-called Republic, terrible translation of Politeia, just the same way. And I read all of Aristotle's texts, metaphysics. They're all concerned with the metaphysics, with the politics, the Nicomachean ethics, to see the divine and to see the purpose of the polis is to uphold the cosmic order. That's oidaimonia, familiarity of the world. It's not happiness. It's the world is familiar because it is orderly. And so just to have this question again, what is the purpose or the task, and how does this of the human being, and how does this relate to meaning?
So on the individual level, I would say it was implemented also through their afterlife beliefs. For instance, you would encounter the weighing of the heart, and there it was determined whether you lived a life according to Ma'at, according to this sacred order. And so there you have the imperative to rightful living and living within these confines of order, and the purpose of upholding it, I would say we find more in the negative examples that you can, for instance, see in literary examples, and also texts like the Book of the Heavenly Cow, where the question is asked in the negative: how does suffering come into the world? How does sort of the negative example look like? And there is an interesting interpretation by the editor of this text and the Egyptologist Miriam Lichtheim, and she says that the non-upholding of Ma'at would almost create what they would envision as tears in the metaphysical fabric of the universe that would then allow chaotic forces to come in. And that this was seen as so dramatic that there are sources like the Book of the Heavenly Cow that specifically say, because of what mankind did and their deeds and their failure to uphold Ma'at, this is why all suffering came into the world. And this is why there was a separation between the realm of the gods and the realm of mankind in the first place. So this is why the sun god left our realm, and why there was even death, why there was linear time. So a large part of their cosmology is based on the negative example. It's almost, it was often also interpreted as a parallel to Genesis, as the fall of mankind. And so here we see the seeds of this entire idea that the entire purpose is to live within these confines of higher order, because otherwise everything falls into chaos and suffering finds a way in, and a separation from the gods will occur. So what you mentioned, like ancient Egypt is the only place where there's an actual union between the divine and the earthly realm. That would all be destroyed, and so that there is a real urgency to that. So that this is not just something where you can choose whether or not you live by it. There is consequences to this. If you act, maybe not one individual, but a whole group of individuals, if you don't act according to these rules, terrible consequences will ensue.
One could speculatively say that that's modernity, but
I sometimes wonder what the ancient Egyptians would say to our world, and I think that this would be their answer. They would say, "Yes, you have not lived according to these higher principles, and look what you got."
Maybe we shouldn't think of the apocalypse or Armageddon as an instant, but it's just drawn out. It can take some time. There's another question that I have. So considering the ancient Egypts, taking them seriously, and their, broadly speaking, metaphysics, their question for meaning, etc. What does that? So obviously there's sort of, we are estranged from them, they are estranged from us. They're in the past. That is sort of, we could say it's very foreign. It doesn't really concern us. Why should we read it? But yeah, why should we read it? Not just in terms of how does this help me live my life, but there must. I think there's something fundamental here. So much so that we wouldn't have the Greeks, for example, without the influence from Egypt. And so why is there a need to retrieve, in a respectful manner, of course, the Egyptian way of being, if you like, or religiosity, even though human consciousness has, of course, evolved and changed since. So I wouldn't say we can't go back. We shouldn't pretend to be Egyptians. That would be a bit absurd. But that would be my question. What the real point of this is?
I would say maybe the richest material that has enriched my life and my worldview is their approach to death, and the actual meaning also of death and the purpose of death that really changed my perspective on it on a very profound level, because the way they approach it is so radically different from how we approach it. I don't know, you probably know, but there was a philosopher who said we separated life from death, and the result is the culture that we see today. And I think that that is the core of what we're suffering from as a civilization today. Because don't forget, the ancient Egyptians were a civilization that functioned coherently for thousands of years. And I think it was because they were able to provide answers to questions, profound questions of the human condition, that we can't really find today. And I think that this is one of the greatest treasures that they can offer us, apart from their entire cognitive framework, which is absolutely fascinating, how they conceptualize time, how they conceptualize the very fabric of reality, which is all tied into their afterlife beliefs. It's a really life-changing experience to go deep into these sources and into this material, apart from what we just discussed with the meaning of life, which I also find fascinating, because it is rarely that you find something that is so clear in giving us as an individual, as humanity, a purpose and a sort of place in this entire cosmos. We're usually conceptualized as something that either it just occurred or was like put into this system, but not as something that is a vital part of this greater metaphysical fabric. So this is a great example on how to think yourself differently within that cognitive framework that is ancient Egypt. And how they would teach us to read them is to immerse ourselves as much as we can, not to come with curiosity, which they hated, but to really come with an open mind and sort of expose ourselves to their ideas and their thinking. This is also how they taught, for instance, in the House of Life, where they instructed their priests and prepared them for the higher stages of wisdom and arcane knowledge. They said you have to learn a new way of thinking, and I think that's sort of the third pillar, apart from meaning, life, and death. It's a different cognitive framework that you can learn from them that is fascinating, that really does widen your mental and cognitive horizons.
And perhaps also
I think those are the three large reasons that I would
good.
that I would
And it heightens our attention.
why it can be very enriching. So
It heightens our attention in a sense. It could, at least. To
not only heighten our attention, but for instance, when you think about how they viewed death as a transition between two different temporal dimensions, and how you sort of transform from a physical being into a physical being, and the whole process behind it is really fascinating, because you gain a completely different insight in how our reality is set up, and it's an interesting thought experiment to sort of think your way all the way through into the afterlife, and not just stop at death, or not sort of separate the two realms, because for them it was almost like a continuity. Again, here we have the permanence of their culture that had to be upheld throughout that barrier that death was. And that is, for me, a fascinating way to approach it.
Can you say more than on transitioning between different temporalities? I mean, broadly speaking, we would think of death, obviously at this point, it's just a biological event, and then off you go. But even in Christianity, it's probably fair to say that it's not really a different temporality, it's timelessness that awaits us on the other side, if anything. Timelessness, or time has little meaning, perhaps. Similar in Platonism, broadly speaking, the ideas are in timelessness. But here's between different temporalities. How is this? I mean, this is really the most difficult part now, but take your time.
The best access to that is an article by Jan Assmann on those two temporal planes, where he explains that there's the cyclical aspect of time, where everything dies and is reborn, which is basically everything that is within this cycle of life. So everything that dies and is constantly reborn, like nature, is part of that, like our perceived reality that we're in right now. And then he differentiates, and this is called Necher time, and then he differentiates between this temporal sphere and jet time. And that is what he calls is not necessarily timelessness, but he calls it suspended time. So it's a state of suspended or virtual being, where things can only exist as they are, but they cannot become. And this is another aspect that you have everywhere in ancient Egyptian culture, the aspect of becoming. That's symbolized by the scarab, which is read out as Teper, and it's translated in different aspects. One is manifestations, one is just becoming, sort of abstract. And it encapsulates this whole notion that in this cyclical temporal sphere that we are in, the acorn can become the oak tree. But in suspended time, you're either forever the oak tree or the acorn, and that you have to sort of have both of these temporal spheres have to interact in a way, and they have to be also ritualistically bound to each other. And that's what you have in the deeper symbolic language of Osiris and the sun god being sort of being united in the Osiris myth, when Osiris sort of it enters into the state of non-being, of non-existence. It is then the sort of energy of the sun god, that quality of the sun god that reinvigorates it and sort of keeps the cyclical time or temporal sphere going. So these are very deep concepts that tie into everything, their afterlife thought, their cosmology. For instance, what I mentioned before, the Book of the Heavenly Cow describes this moment where this separation happens as almost like a Big Bang Theory description, where the minute the gods leave our physical realm, the sun god leaves and creates another atemporal realm, which is then upheld. There is a depiction of it on a shrine in the tomb of Tutankhamun, where you can see the different temporal goddesses upholding our reality. So there is this concept is really permeating all aspects of ancient Egyptian thought, metaphysics, afterlife, sort of concepts, and these the shift between these two realms or these two temporal spheres is what death is all about. And a lot of these texts, also like in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, you can read how you can make this shift, how you can make this journey, how you can go from being within the cyclical realm, where ideally you have completed your becoming from acorn to oak tree, and have fully developed into whatever it was sort of you were here to turn into, to transform into, or to become. And then you return to suspended time in your I want to say forever ghost outfit. So you sort of then become spirit, and what they would call effective spirit. They call it an ach. And you exist ideally, if you fully succeed in all the different stages, you're even able to go back and forth as a spirit of pure light, or as an effective spirit, and you're then also able to come forth by day. And this brings us back to the mummy. The function of the mummy is to act as an anchor in the here and in sort of this part of existence, and the spirit can then return to its sort of worldly existence. And for that, it needs the mummy to be sort of anchored into permanence, into a state of being down in this realm. I hope this makes sense.
Now I have something to do, and I have to complete myself and try and become, some spirit that can go back and forth. To be as good, you might say, a Gesamtkunstwerk. There are echoes here that I can hear I can hear echoes of this, or more than echoes, perhaps, in Aristotle, in just what we refer to as potentiality, actuality, dynamis, energeia, to use the Greek terms that he uses, and also the entelecheia, fulfillment of what one is. Sort of, you're becoming what you are, in a sense, but you have to become it. It's you're not just already. You have to actualize it, to use a contemporary word.
Or how about Plato's idea of everything existing in a sort of suspended state as an idea, and then so there's like an idea of a table, or there's an idea of everything that exists, right, in some sort of suspended state. I don't know how it works, how it mirrors back into our world, but I remember that concept too from Plato.
depends who reads Plato. But there is, if you're Aristotle, then you would say, how is that even possible? Just one idea of the human being for all human beings, too universalistic, we might say, and then removed from reality. So if you want to be, let's say Plato was a Platonist, that makes it easier for me. Then Plato's ultimate reality, that's what's real. The idea of the table, the idea of man, broadly speaking, the idea of the tree, etc. And then down here, everything is a reflection of it. Hence, we have to be very careful with artistry or art in general, because it removes. So a carpenter makes a bed, and that's one step removed from reality. But if an artist now draws or paints a bed, well, that's already two steps or layers removed from reality. So you're further and further in sort of reflection, or you could almost say illusion. So but it's a lot more complicated. But that's the easiest way one could at least address quote unquote Platonism.
I was more interested in what I was calling to mind was his idea of a virtual suspended realm where everything sort of pre-exists or coexists or something. I was just wondering like how that realm was conceptualized, if this was something that we can return to, if it was just a completely abstract
it's
notion or
hyper Uranus. It's not purely abstract. So it's above the heaven. And the idea is described, for example, as even beyond being, for example, in the allegory or analogy or simile of the cave, or the myth of the cave, as I like to say. And the task of the human being is to remember the ideas.
Oh, so it's a state beyond being. So it's not really a place where we could go or we could transition.
No, because the soul keeps being reborn. That's a place where, when modern Plato scholar wouldn't want to go, but the soul keeps being reborn. Book 10 is very clear about this in the Politeia. And the task of the soul is in life to remember the ideas. So we can remember, for example, arete, which is virtue. You cannot teach abstract virtue. You need to actually teach someone to be virtuous in life. It's not, it's not just the abstract concept is enough, but the reason why we even have quote unquote arete or virtue is because the soul is capable of anamnesis and remembers the ideas, because the soul travels when we die. The soul travels to the ideas and then is reborn.
Oh, okay.
And once it's reborn as what we might just say physical body, then the task of the human being is to remember. So we constantly have to recollect what is justice, what is freedom, etc. And it's not just given to us. We have to draw it out, and we can't ever just stop with the ordinary notions that we have, or the level of doxa, which might just be opinion, or just a mere semblance of it. That's the problem of sophistry. So the sophists walk around the market square and say, well, I can teach you virtue. Here, I teach you virtue. Socrates comes along and says, well, what is virtue? And they can't answer it. So, and hence, but how we get to it is because the soul remembers. And hence, everyone can remember, right? A slave boy can just as much remember what virtue is, or can remember geometrical problems, etc. Because it's in the soul, which continues to be reborn and goes through the ideas, and then its task is to remember. So there's a connection then that between the afterlife, let's say, and the here. Yes, there is.
I always wondered about that. I always wondered how the connection was between those two concepts, and if they were at all compatible, but not really from what I hear now.
No, it's not compatible, but you can see that there's always there's always an attempt to try and bring together the life and death. Let's just put it like this, to try and see that there's some sort of a connection. That we're not just What is, let's say, similar is that we're not just, as Heidegger might say, thrown into the world, or tabula rasa, empty Rawls, or before him John Locke, just empty canvases. But there's some task you have that is well beyond your individual existence. It is actually cosmic. And the task for Plato is to remember. The problem always is, of course, that, speaking about this in Plato, they just beat out of you over years and years and years, because that's the Plato that's just images. That's don't worry about this stuff. That's just the real Plato is the logical Plato, the dialectical Plato. And this is something you mentioned before we hit the record button, the difference between mythic thinking and literal thinking. I think, for example, that Plato is a myth maker. He writes myth in a time when myth is already dying. He doesn't just preserve myth as a storybook, but he writes his own myths. The cave is a myth, I think, and he tells us of the myth of Atlantis, which he may have heard from Egypt. He writes a mythic origin story for Athens, etc. So I wonder because you said a few things before we started recording, what the difference is then between mythic thinking, allegoric thinking perhaps, and literal thinking.
I think it's really also the source for the greatest misunderstandings when reading ancient Egyptian texts, because they make little to no sense if you only read them at face value, or like literally, because the thinking behind it, what was famously coined mythical thinking, thinks in relationships. It's almost a relational thinking and not a causal, like thinking grounded in causality, or in logic. So what is trying to be achieved here is to give you a deeper understanding of greater of the greater metaphysical fabric of greater relationships, and for the best example is the Osiris myth, which makes little to no sense, that there's somebody hacked into pieces by his brother Seth and then put back together by Isis, his wife, and revenged by his son Horus. And you look at the story, and then you get movies like The Gods of Egypt which is a very funny example when you don't understand your source material, where they just put sort of this actual story into a very gaudy, weird movie. And have not understood the non-existence of Osiris, being cut into pieces and sort of going through this state of non-being, where he is so sacred and secret that even Herodotus, after returning from Egypt, was hesitant to speak Osiris's name, because he said it's such a deep mystery that even his name should not be mentioned. And like the most sacred places where he was revered, they would say not even the birds would dare to fly into that little I don't know how you call it, the hind, a flock of trees. And so the deeper mystery behind it gets completely lost if you only read the story word for word. And what it is really about is this belief that the whole regenerative power that brings forth eternal life, and that brings forth sort of the everlasting cyclical recurrence of life, it lies within this deep, mysterious state of non-being. This is where Osiris unites with Ra, with the sun god, and this is what the ancient Egyptians considered their greatest mystery of their culture. And they say that the ability of the sun to renew itself in its course through the underworld is also tied to this mystery of Osiris. And if you only look at the story, visualized, for instance, the god of Egypt, there's an actual sun god on a bark riding around through the underworld, killing the snake that is chaos, that is Apophis, actually killing it. And like that, it reads like a children's story, but the deeper concepts behind it are their own deeper metaphysical system, where they say these sort of forces of chaos occur in this state of non-being, in this state where you're not materialized, we're not part of this reality within the confines of like time, space, linear time. And as soon as you exit this, you are confronted with chaos, with non-being, and you need very specific rituals, magic. Magic to them was a cultural technology used in a very pragmatic way to overcome these states of complete chaos. I mean, if you think about it, you die tomorrow, you no longer have your body, but you all of a sudden find yourself still existing. I mean, the shock of this, to realize, oh, wait a minute, everything is fallen away, time, space, physicality. So who and what am I now? So to them, these myths were a tool given to you to create meaning and relationships in a state of non-being. Just imagine that. Do you think our parts of us, of our mind, are still existing in this absolutely chaotic state where nothing you knew before has to be reinvented, reconceptualized? So it goes into a very deep chasm, so to speak, because that's what I mentioned before. They really thought all the way through of what death actually is and what kind of tools and spells and reconfigurations you would specifically need to keep on existing, even though you've lost your physical state of being. And that is all inscribed in these myths. So almost like dream logic, where things don't make logical sense, where you can breathe underwater, you turn into a fish, and it's all perfectly reasonable within the dream logic. They talk to the part of your mind that they believed would still be existing after passing through the barrier that is death. And that is what myth sort of talks to or encapsulates. And that's why it seems crazy at some points, or it seems to make little to no sense. But to them, this was the ultimate cultural technology that they would provide you with to survive this other state of being. And that's how it has to be read. It has to be read as a pragmatic guide, but also as a text that is trying to reach the deepest confines of your, we would call it now with modern psychology, your subconscious, and trying to prepare you for everything that is to come in this other state of being, which is fascinating because it's almost a pragmatic approach. It's not just abstract. It's not just philosophy. It was thought and conceptualized as a real manual, as a real tool. Same with the Book of the Dead. It was a manual of very specific spells to transfigure you. And that is where a literal interpretation and literal reading just does not comprehend because the purpose and the use of the text does not really correlate to just storytelling. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, and also good the little stab against the philosophers Mephistopheles, or Goethe has Mephistopheles say quite often in the second Faust that wherever there's a philosopher, there's more. They just call on more ghosts, so they make up more things. But it's not abstract thought experiment. It's how they live and push thinking to its limits, in a sense, to the I think, altered state of being, you say.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. It pushes it into the liminal realm of non-existence and further and beyond. And that is how it should be read, because that is who and what it was for. And what is also one of the biggest understandings about the Book of the Dead, where I just wrote an article about the need for mythic thinking to understand the relationships that they were actually trying to depict here between those different temporal realms, and between the different transfigurations, for instance. So they believed if you wanted to transform into something, you could mentally, by creating an image or a vision of it, you could sort of become it. And that is a concept that you also find in Egyptian magic in general. And here we also come to the importance of symbolic writing and how that ties into this cultural technology of using, did you say efficacious speech to bring something into being? That's another very important aspect. This is the texts, like the Book of the Dead, are not just stories. It was believed to be the kind of speech that would bring things into being, that would manifest things. And that is also a deeper, the deeply ingrained purpose of the writing system and of the language that was believed to have power in and of itself, and bring things about just by reading and speaking them.
Could you say more than maybe now on hieroglyphs? I mean, you teach your, let's just say, seminar participants hieroglyphs to be able to read them, and how important that is for any deeper access to ancient Egyptian culture or being. What are the hieroglyphs? Are they just sort of silly symbols? Or is it more than, is it actually a language that was, so it's not a language that was spoken, that was or actually
So
it was.
the language in itself had, I would say, three main stages. You have Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, and New Egyptian, going along with these different time periods in Egypt, which are intersected by two periods of conquest and chaos, the thing they feared the most. So if their apocalypse, and then the consolidation of power structures in ancient Egypt. So what you usually learn is Middle Egyptian. And that was sort of kept alive because most of the literature and the religious texts were canonized in that stage of the language. So the spoken Egyptian would evolve and be different from the actual High Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, however you want to call it, they used for their religious texts. And hieroglyphic writing in its in the form that we see it, like how it's inscribed on temple walls, that also stayed roughly the same. But then you had like what scribes would use is hieratic, which is a faster written form. And that would also evolve over time and then turn into demotic. So if you look at the Rosetta Stone, where you have hieroglyphs, demotic, and Greek, you have sort of the the symbol and the language of permanence that would stay the same over 3,000 years. And then you have demotic, which is what was used at the time by scribes, the faster writing system that was used for contracts and for everyday correspondence and letters. And then you have Greek, obviously, and that was then used to decipher for the first time after thousands of years hieroglyphic writing, because for the longest time nobody could read it. And the principle of hieroglyphs, I would say, is that it is many things at once. We have that in ancient Egypt a lot, that things can be many things at the same time, and they had no issue with that ambiguity. So you have, for instance, the hieroglyph of Ra, the sun. It can mean actually Ra. It can also spell the two letters Ra. And it can be a so-called determinative or classifier that is put at the end of the word, spelled Heru, for instance, which means day, and then you put a little sun hieroglyph just to further specify the meaning of the word you just spelled. So you have that with most hieroglyphs. They have three different functions. One is to actually spell out phonetically a number of letters, or 1 to 3 letters. One is to be a symbol, actually. Could be they stand for an entire word, or to be determinative. And here is where the nuance comes in, is in the determinative. So if you put certain determinatives that were not read out loud at the end of a word, this is where you can modify meaning, obviously. So there is no use in going too deeply into the actual spelling of the words, because sometimes it was really just used, even the scarab that I mentioned, which spells 3 letters, the sound P, P, and R. And these 3 letters could be just used to spell a name, for instance. So there is not always necessarily a deeper meaning inscribed every time you use that hieroglyph. But if you put it at the end of a word, and it is there as a classifier, you could convey different semantic connotations. So that's, in a nutshell, where the sort of real intricacies of reading hieroglyphs lie. And I wrote an article about this called Lost in Translation, where I go into this, because you can also, and this is very fascinating, you can see the very early stages of conceptualizing a language. Because when you look at how they use those classifiers and determinatives, you can see how they sort of created the earliest clusters of meaning. And there's just some interesting curiosities from, they would have like one classifier for animal, and it's a little hide with a tail hanging off of it. And that classifier is used for anything, from a donkey to a scorpion. And they also did not actually have a word for animals. So they would just put that classifier there, and then whatever was crawling, walking around that was not human was classified like this. And that's a fascinating way, because in our language, we have all these different semantic clusters of different animals, and they just did not worry about that. So you can also see early stages of language development that are really interesting to look at. Why is this classified like this? Or why does this sort of come with this specific determinative? So once you have an eye for that, you can see in metaphysical texts. For instance, I write about this in The Lost in Translation, but also in the Book of the Dead. You come to a place where the soul travels to the horizon, and then you actually have a mixture of using actual metaphor to express death. This is also expressed in the hieroglyphs. You have an actual horizon there. There's a word for dying. And then you have another word, kentiu, where you arrive. And this is the path. This word means the end of time. And it is spelled, and then in some texts, this word gets 2 paths. And this is not said out loud. It just is put there as a determinative. So the end of time is written with 2 hieroglyphs, not spelling, but conveying the semantic meaning of a path. So there is a path out of the end of time that is not spelled, it's not said out loud, but it's in there, in the visually and conceptually. And you could not see that. And that's what Hermes Trismegistus is trying to say. You can't see that, and you can't translate it. So all of this meta meaning gets lost when you try to translate these texts. And it's not how can I say, it's again more pragmatic than people imagine, you know, because they think, oh, this is some hocus pocus and strange magic, but it is really all about the semantics behind it, the meaning behind it, and deeper concepts that are conveyed here, and not that like one of these words means abracadabra and have some special power and something happens. It's again, it's a tool that is given to you for very difficult transfigurations, for very difficult passages through realms of chaos, and that is, I think, important to show, because you can again not only widen your horizon when it comes to ancient Egypt, but it's also an interesting experiment in anthropological self-reflection, where you just sort of by encountering something so strange and so other, and concepts that are executed in such a specific and interesting way, that you could really reflect on how we deal with abstract philosophical thought, which is very rarely so pragmatic and so let's say oriented with on its intended use later on.
So on the issue of hieroglyphs and writing, should we think of the hieroglyphs or of their written language as only present in, let's say, the pyramids or the temples? So there's nothing that the common man would have any contact with, or is there literature?
There is a lot of literature in ancient Egypt, and it had also a very specific purpose. It was the place where but most of their social, political, and cultural discourse took place. So what I mentioned in the beginning, where we have the best sources to find out how the Egyptians actually felt about something, is in their literary texts. And the problem here is, with our modern definition of literature, is that they did not really define literature as a canonized genre. They had this expression which was called the beautiful words, and similar to the French belles lettres concept. And to them, it could be composed by anybody and be consumed by anyone. So they believed, and there are actual sources in the teachings of Amenhotep, for instance, where they say you can find the talent to compose beautiful metaphor, as rare as it is, you can find it anywhere. You can find it even with the women at the well. And there's one very famous text that's called the Eloquent Peasant, where a peasant that has fallen on hard times is making a case in front of Pharaoh on the importance of Ma'at and higher cosmic order. So it was not only considered something that anybody could compose that had the talent for metaphor and beautiful words, it was also a very open form of expression, where even an uneducated farmer could speak on the very highest concepts of their culture. So that is one aspect that's really fascinating. And the other is how these texts were universally known, if not read, because of course literacy was only something that a scribe could attain, because it took at least 4 years, I think, of rigorous training to be able to read and write hieroglyphs. But the oral circulation was very active. So similar to some pieces of high literature that maybe not everybody has read, most people were familiar with the story, with the overarching themes, and with certain topoi. So what you also have when you read some official inscriptions is that you would find literary allusions to popular stories. You have Greek sources, where Greek travelers would come to Egypt and they would ask for the history of a certain king, and they would be given stories from literature as actual history by their guides. And the other aspect was that you can tell from demographic registers, from the names that they would give their children, that some pieces of literature were extremely popular. So people, even like somewhere in the country, I don't know, a beer brewer would then call his son, I don't know, and Ishmael, if we want to take Moby Dick. So from there you can tell, okay, they had to be a certain saturation of like knowledge within the culture that was not only accessible to people that were highly educated. And the other aspect that's really interesting when you read these pieces of literature, there's really everything from folk tales, fairy tales, magicians' tales, to highly philosophical texts, which they would call their wisdom literature, which were actual teachings. And then there are liturgies and hymns and poetry. There's love poetry. There's there are in a way genres, but they are always interspersed with other genres. So they would never stick to just one type of text. So, for instance, in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, you have cosmology, you have a hymn, you have everything sort of interchangeably used. And in a piece of love poetry, you find all of a sudden a magic spell. So they would not really clearly differentiate between liturgy, religious texts, or magic, which was also part of their religious machinery, but they would not really make that distinction so clearly. So it all is interwoven. But I would say to really understand Egyptian culture, you have to understand this corpus of texts and a lot of their main themes that are discussed in there, and also to sort of realize that in many of these texts there is a very abiding satire. There's even a text that's called the Satire of Trades, where a scribe talks to his son about the profession of becoming a scribe, and then he names all the other professions in a very satirizing and biting, humorous way. So there is a vast landscape of ancient Egyptian thought that most people don't know about, but that's very rich in terms of getting to know this culture better at a almost personal level, I would say.
Right. So this is these are things that you teach or lecture on. So in closing, if you like, if there's anything that we've left out that you'd like to add, feel free to do so, and also let people know where and how to find you.
So right now, my main platform or place of publication is Substack, where you can read all of my articles for free. There's no paywall, and I do weekly or bi-weekly live sessions where I talk on a vast number of topics. Like last week, it was apocalyptic literature. I talk about metaphysics. I talk about the meaning of life. I also sometimes touch on esoteric Egypt, which is sort of a mixture of the reception of Egypt by different esoteric groups, but also the reception of Egypt throughout the centuries afterwards. So there is a variety of topics that I cover on my Substack, and we're a very active community there, and I invite everybody to come and join us. And I also post notes every other day with just smaller, interesting finds, and for instance, smaller pieces of literature, a love poem here and there, or last week I talked about Egyptomania and how it influenced the reception of ancient Egypt after the conquest of Napoleon, and the Description d'Egypte came out of Egypt, and sort of the reactions and the aestheticism that it spawned. So there are a lot of interesting approaches and forms how you can look at Egypt with a new pair of eyes. And that's what
excellent. And you had a watch party of the mummy recently, I saw.
Yes, that's that was a popular request, which which was suggested to sort of make that jump into pop culture and to look how we now in modernity sort of interpret ancient Egypt and what we make out of these themes, because the mummy unwrappings and the commercialization and commodification of mummies that started exactly with that Egyptomania, where they had, for instance, live mummy unwrappings in London, and it's so and then it sort of made its way into the horror genre, and with the curse of the mummy after opening the tomb of Tutankhamun, it spawned a whole genre of its own in modern pop culture. And I find it interesting to explore, because if you sort of interpret our extreme fascination that we have today with mummies, and you mentioned that before, why is it always about the mummy? And I think it is psychologically, it is a sort of need to unwrap something here about our own mortality, about the physicality of it, about the sort of unresolved psychological trauma and need of the resolution, and the realist sense. For instance, they ground the mummies down and then consumed it. There was a whole market for that in the Victorian age.
Yes.
So there is an interesting way how our culture chooses to interact with ancient Egypt, which is very rich in terms of the again, anthropological self-reflection. Why do we do this? Why do we choose to interact with Egypt that way? And in sort of either be it horror, or like the mummy in a more humorous and adventure Indiana Jones kind of way, where we just sort of go in there and we grab what we can and run back out before the mummy can get us. It's an interesting experiment to see why we choose to approach ancient Egypt in that way, and not, I don't know, by reading their literature, for instance. Why don't we do that? Why do we choose to ground down mummy remains and eat them and unwrap them live instead of, or they and in France turn their aestheticism and their iconography into furniture, into something that we can have in our house. So those are just interesting thought experiments for us to see, how we interact with other cultures and why.
There is in Highgate Cemetery in North London, the Egyptian Avenue, which, if people haven't seen it, it's not purely Egyptian. There are other elements in there too, but it's one of those ways in which, in the Victorian age, the Egyptomania made its way into that, and the high society of that time wanted to be buried there. And tried to make sure that it got a place. Very fascinating. Marx is buried there too. Not in the Egyptian Avenue, but on the other side of the Highgate Cemetery.
Yeah, but the reception of ancient Egypt throughout the centuries, and which parts were chosen to be exported, and like which cults, for instance, and which ideas, also the whole history of Hermes Trismegistus and how it found its ways into different esoteric circles, is in and of itself a fascinating subject that we could talk about for hours. And there's great books written about it, also by great Egyptologists, because it's so fascinating what Western culture, or like Occidental culture, did with this whole with the cultural heritage of ancient Egypt, and how we chose to export it and implement it into our own belief systems, and which parts we sort of picked and chose. And then on all of that, always what people keep forgetting is that hieroglyphs could not be read. So there are a lot of philosophers, I think also Goethe, that lamented that fact, that he could not read the actual language. And they were more, I think, conscious of the fact that we can never really truly understand the culture without reading their texts, and that is what I'm really trying to do, to make it more accessible and to give people the chance to read their greatest literature writings, and also their letters, and sort of meet ancient Egypt in their own words and through their own sources.
Excellent. So I'll link to your Substack, obviously. I will publish this on Substack as well. So Carla, thank you very much for your time and your very interesting remarks here. I learned a lot, took lots of notes, so thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope we'll do it again, maybe about the history of reception or other philosophical themes.
There is a lot to explore.
There's a lot to explore, yeah.